The ancient grandfather clock in Windermere Palace struck midnight as Queen Isabella's trembling hands signed the document that would shake the very foundations of the Aldorian monarchy. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the kingdom, mirroring the tempest brewing within the palace walls. In just 12 hours, the world would learn that the most powerful royal family in Europe had been torn apart by secrets, betrayal, and a shocking decision that would strip two heirs of their birthright forever. This is the story of how a mother's desperate love for her youngest son would either save or destroy a 1,000-year-old dynasty. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Windermere Palace as Prince Alexander strode purposefully toward the royal council chambers. His perfectly pressed military uniform bore the gleaming insignia of his rank as heir apparent. But the weight of expectation felt heavier than any medal on his chest. At 35, Alexander had spent his entire life preparing to rule the kingdom of Aldoria. Yet today he felt more uncertain than ever about his future. The kingdom had been in turmoil for months. Economic struggles, political scandals, and a growing Republican movement had shaken public confidence in the monarchy. Alexander's popularity had plummeted following a series of unfortunate public appearances and controversial statements about social reform. The press, once respectful of royal protocol, now questioned everything from his fitness to rule to his understanding of modern Aldoria. Queen Isabella watched her eldest son from the window of her private study, her heart heavy with the burden of knowledge she carried. The medical reports hidden in her desk drawer painted a grim picture. The neurological condition that had slowly been affecting her judgment and memory was progressing faster than the doctors had initially predicted. She had perhaps months, not years, before she would be unable to make coherent decisions about the kingdom's future. Behind her, Princess Victoria paced like a caged lioness. Alexander's wife had grown increasingly frustrated with the constant criticism her husband faced. Her aristocratic background and sharp intellect made her a formidable ally, but her impatience with protocol and tendency towards sharp-tongued responses had created additional controversies. The noble families who had once supported Alexander were beginning to whisper about Victoria's influence over him. "Mother, we cannot continue to ignore the obvious," Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The parliament is growing bolder by the day. They're questioning Alexander's every decision, undermining his authority at every turn. If we don't act soon, they'll have enough support to seriously challenge the monarchy itself." Isabella turned from the window, her aged but still sharp eyes meeting her daughter-in-law's gaze. "And what would you have us do, Victoria? Dissolve Parliament? Ignore the will of the people who are struggling while we live in luxury?" "I would have us remember who we are," Victoria replied coldly. "We are the royal family of Aldoria. Our bloodline has ruled this kingdom for 1,000 years. We don't bend to the whims of politicians and commoners." The Queen's expression hardened. This was exactly the attitude that had contributed to their current predicament. Victoria's inability to understand the delicate balance between royal authority and public service had become a significant liability. The people of Aldoria weren't subjects to be commanded. They were citizens who deserved respect and consideration. Meanwhile, in the kingdom's second-largest city of North Haven, Prince Henry worked quietly in a community center, helping distribute food to families affected by the recent economic downturn. The younger prince had always preferred hands-on service to ceremonial duties, much to his brother's frequent annoyance. At 31, Henry possessed a natural charisma and genuine empathy that endeared him to ordinary citizens. Unlike Alexander, who had been groomed from birth for kingship with private tutors and exclusive institutions, Henry had insisted on attending public university and serving in the regular army rather than the ceremonial guard. His military service and overseas peacekeeping missions had earned him genuine respect from veterans and active military personnel. His subsequent work with various charitable organizations had built a network of supporters among social workers, teachers, and community leaders. Sarah Coleman, a social worker who had become Henry's closest friend and rumored romantic interest, watched him interact with a group of unemployed factory workers. The easy way he listened to their concerns, asked thoughtful questions, and offered practical suggestions rather than empty platitudes had impressed everyone present. Sarah had grown up in a working-class family and understood the struggles these people faced in ways the rest of the royal family simply couldn't. "You know they're talking about you again," Sarah said quietly as they walked between the food distribution tables. "The polls show your approval ratings are nearly double Alexander's." Henry sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I never asked for that kind of attention, Sarah. Alexander is the heir. It's his responsibility to lead, and my job to support him. But what if the kingdom needs something different? Sarah pressed gently. What if traditional succession isn't what's best for Aldoria right now? The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. The possibility that Henry might be better suited to lead the kingdom in its current crisis had been growing in many minds, but speaking it aloud felt dangerously close to treason. Back at the palace, Alexander struggled through another tense meeting with Prime Minister Margaret Thornfield and her cabinet. The economic recovery package they were discussing would require significant cuts to the royal budget, something Victoria had been fighting against for weeks. Alexander found himself caught between his wife's insistence on maintaining royal dignity and the practical necessity of showing the people that the monarchy was willing to share in their sacrifices. Your Majesty, Prime Minister Thornfield said carefully, the people need to see that the royal family understands the severity of our current situation. These budget reductions would demonstrate your commitment to the kingdom's welfare. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He understood the political necessity, but Victoria's arguments about maintaining royal prestige echoed in his mind. Prime Minister, surely we can find alternatives that don't compromise the institution of monarchy itself. The Prime Minister exchanged glances with her colleagues. This was exactly the kind of response that had been eroding confidence in Alexander's leadership. His inability to make difficult decisions when they conflicted with his personal comfort was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except himself. As the meeting concluded with no resolution, Alexander felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Every decision seemed fraught with impossible choices. Please the people and risk weakening the monarchy, or maintain traditional royal prerogatives and face growing Republican sentiment. He had never felt less prepared for the crown that would inevitably be his. That evening, Queen Isabella summoned both her sons to her private chambers for what she called a family dinner, though the formal setting and tense atmosphere suggested something more significant. The Queen had spent hours in consultation with her most trusted advisors, constitutional experts, and even reached out quietly to former monarchs from neighboring countries who had faced similar crises. Prince Henry arrived first, still wearing the simple clothes he had worn to the community center. His genuine surprise at finding the dinner table set with the finest china and crystal suggested he truly hadn't anticipated anything unusual. Alexander arrived precisely on time, with Victoria beside him despite not being explicitly invited. Her presence immediately shifted the dynamics in the room. I've been thinking a great deal about our family's future. Queen Isabella began slowly, studying both her sons' faces. About what's best for Aldoria, and what's best for the monarchy itself. Alexander straightened, assuming this was another discussion about his public image problems. Victoria placed a protective hand on his arm, ready to defend her husband against any criticism. The kingdom is changing, perhaps faster than any of us anticipated, the Queen continued. The people's expectations of their leaders have evolved. They want accessibility, authenticity, and genuine understanding of their daily struggles. Mother, Alexander interrupted, if this is about the budget cuts, I've already told you I'm prepared to make reasonable compromises. Queen Isabella raised a hand to silence him. This isn't about budget cuts, Alexander. This is about something far more fundamental. This is about whether our family's approach to monarchy is still serving the people we're meant to protect and guide. The words hung heavy in the air. Victoria's grip on Alexander's arm tightened, and Henry shifted uncomfortably, sensing an undercurrent he didn't fully understand. I've made a decision that I believe will give our kingdom the leadership it needs for the challenges ahead, the Queen announced, her voice gaining strength. But it will require sacrifices from all of us, and it will change our family forever. The storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally broke, sending rain against the ancient windows of the palace. Inside, 3 generations of royalty sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the Queen's words might mean. None of them could have imagined that within hours, the very foundations of their world would be shaken to their core. As if sensing the gravity of the moment, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Servants moved quietly through distant corridors, unaware that their queen was preparing to make the most controversial decision in Aldorian royal history. In her pocket, Isabella fingered the document she had spent weeks having drafted in absolute secrecy, a document that would strip one heir of his birthright and elevate another to a position he had never sought. The die was cast, though none of them knew it yet. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would divide the royal family, shock the nation, and force every citizen of Aldoria to question everything they thought they knew about monarchy, duty, and the price of power. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over Windmere Palace, matching the mood that had settled over the royal family after the previous evening's cryptic dinner conversation. Queen Isabella had retired to her chambers without revealing her decision, leaving Alexander, Victoria, and Henry to spend a sleepless night wondering what earth-shattering announcement awaited them. Alexander had paced his suite until nearly 3 in the morning, with Victoria alternately trying to calm him and strategizing potential responses to whatever their mother-in-law might propose. They both understood that the Queen's words had carried an ominous weight that suggested fundamental changes to their carefully planned future. Henry had returned to his modest apartment in the palace's east wing, choosing to sleep in his childhood bedroom rather than the grand suite designated for the spare heir. Sarah had called twice, sensing something significant in his unusually brief text messages, but he had been unable to articulate the growing sense of unease that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. At precisely 9 o'clock, all three received formal summons to the Queen's private study. The choice of venue was significant. This was where Isabella conducted her most serious royal business, where she met with heads of state and made decisions that affected millions of lives. The room's rich mahogany paneling and walls lined with portraits of previous monarchs created an atmosphere of weighty tradition and inescapable history. Queen Isabella sat behind her antique desk, looking every inch the sovereign despite her advanced age and declining health. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, her navy blue dress immaculate, and her famous sapphire brooch caught the morning light streaming through tall windows. But those who knew her well would have noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the careful way she positioned herself to maintain her regal bearing. Alexander entered first, his military bearing automatic after decades of training, followed immediately by Victoria, who had clearly dressed for battle in a sharp charcoal suit that emphasized her formidable presence. Henry came last, having hastily changed from his casual clothes into a proper suit, though his tie remained slightly askew in a way that somehow made him appear more approachable rather than unprofessional. "Please, sit down," the Queen said, gesturing to the 3 chairs arranged in a semicircle facing her desk. The formal arrangement immediately put everyone on edge, as family discussions typically took place in the more comfortable seating area near the fireplace. Isabella opened a leather portfolio that had been sitting closed on her desk, revealing several official-looking documents. The royal seal was visible on at least one of them, indicating that whatever decisions had been made were already legally binding rather than merely under consideration. "I spent much of last night reviewing the constitutional provisions regarding royal succession," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested she was about to deliver news that would devastate at least one of her listeners. "Most people assume that succession is automatic and unchangeable, but our laws actually provide the reigning monarch with considerable discretionary authority in extraordinary circumstances." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her lawyer's instincts immediately recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. Constitutional law regarding royal succession was deliberately complex, with historical precedents that could be interpreted in various ways depending on the specific circumstances and the political climate. "Mother," Alexander said carefully, "perhaps you should simply tell us what you've decided rather than building suspense. We're family, after all." Queen Isabella's eyes softened slightly as she looked at her eldest son. Despite everything that had happened, despite all her concerns about his suitability for the crown, she genuinely loved Alexander and knew that what she was about to announce would cause him tremendous pain. The Kingdom of Aldoria faces the most serious challenges to its stability since the Great War, she continued, her words measured and precise. Economic uncertainty, political upheaval, and a growing movement questioning the very relevance of monarchy in the modern world. These are not problems that can be solved through traditional royal responses or ceremonial gestures. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before continuing. "Our people need leadership that can bridge the gap between royal tradition and contemporary reality. They need someone who understands both the dignity of our institutions and the daily struggles of ordinary citizens." Henry began to sense where this conversation might be heading, and a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He had always been content with his position as the spare heir, supporting his brother while pursuing his own interests in social service and community development. The thought that he might be thrust into the spotlight terrified him more than he cared to admit. Over the past several months, I have consulted extensively with constitutional scholars, former prime ministers, and trusted advisors about the best path forward for our kingdom, the Queen announced. The conclusion has been unanimous. Aldoria needs different leadership than what our traditional succession would provide. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Your Majesty, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I must remind you that Alexander has dedicated his entire life to preparing for the crown. He has sacrificed personal desires, followed royal protocol to the letter, and never wavered in his commitment to duty. Victoria is right, Mother, Alexander added, though his voice lacked the conviction it should have carried. Deep down, some part of him had always wondered if he was truly suited for kingship, but admitting such doubts felt like betraying everything he had been taught about royal obligation. Queen Isabella nodded acknowledgement. Ally. Alexander's dedication has never been in question. His character, his intelligence, and his sense of duty are all exemplary. But the kingdom's needs have evolved beyond what traditional preparation can address. She lifted one of the documents from her desk, holding it so that all three could see the official royal seal and formal legal language. I have signed a decree of succession modification, effective immediately upon my abdication, which will occur at noon today. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Alexander's face went white, Victoria gasped audibly, and Henry looked as though he might be sick. None of them had anticipated that the Queen would abdicate, much less that she would do so while implementing fundamental changes to the succession. The decree names Prince Henry as my immediate successor to the throne of Aldoria, Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the words that she knew would change everything. Prince Alexander and Princess Victoria are hereby stripped of all royal titles, privileges, and positions within the royal hierarchy. Victoria shot to her feet, her careful composure completely abandoned. This is outrageous. You cannot simply discard the rightful heir because of temporary political difficulties. Alexander was born to be king. It's his birthright, his destiny. Birthright and destiny are luxuries that kingdoms in crisis cannot afford, the Queen replied coldly. The crown belongs to whoever can best serve the people of Aldoria, not whoever happened to be born first. Alexander sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling from the implications of his mother's announcement. Everything he had ever known about his future, his purpose, his identity, had just been stripped away in a matter of minutes. The crown he had been preparing to inherit his entire life was being handed to his younger brother, and there was apparently nothing he could do to stop it. Henry finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Mother, I never asked for this. I never wanted to be king. Alexander is the heir. This isn't right. What you want and what is right are not always the same thing, Henry, Isabella replied, though her tone was gentler when addressing her younger son. I've watched you work with ordinary people, listened to how they respond to you, seen how you inspire trust and confidence without even trying. Those are not skills that can be taught or inherited. They are gifts that our kingdom desperately needs right now. The room fell into a heavy silence as the full magnitude of the Queen's decision began to sink in. This wasn't merely a change in succession. It was a complete restructuring of their family's hierarchy and future. Alexander and Victoria would go from being the most important members of the royal family to being essentially ordinary citizens overnight. The formal announcement will be made to Parliament and the public at 2 o'clock this afternoon, the Queen continued, consulting a schedule that had obviously been carefully planned. Henry's coronation will take place 1 week from today, allowing for the minimum constitutionally required preparation period. Victoria's eyes blazed with fury. This is a coup disguised as a family decision. You're destroying 1,000 years of tradition because you've lost faith in your own son's abilities. I'm saving the monarchy by ensuring it remains relevant to the people it serves, Isabella shot back. Alexander's inability to connect with ordinary citizens, combined with your own tone-deaf approach to public relations, would have destroyed the institution within a generation. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Victoria's face flushed red, not just with anger, but with the recognition that the Queen's words contained enough truth to be devastating. Her aristocratic background and impatience with common people had indeed created numerous public relations disasters over the years. Alexander finally spoke, his voice hollow and distant. So that's it. 35 years of preparation, of duty, of sacrifice, and you just decide I'm not suitable anymore. Queen Isabella's expression softened, and for a moment she looked less like a sovereign making a state decision and more like a mother breaking her child's heart. Alexander, you are a good man, an honorable man, but good and honorable are not always enough. The kingdom needs someone who can inspire hope in people who have lost faith in their institutions. And you think Henry can do that? Alexander asked, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. I know he can, Isabella replied firmly. The people love him already. He understands their struggles because he's taken the time to share them. He has the natural charisma and genuine empathy that effective leadership requires in difficult times. Henry stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I won't do it. I won't accept the crown that was stolen from my brother. Find another solution, mother. This is wrong, and everyone knows it. The queen's eyes flashed with steel. You will accept the crown because the kingdom requires it, and because refusing would create a constitutional crisis that could destroy the monarchy entirely. Your personal feelings about the situation are irrelevant compared to your duty to the people of Aldoria. My duty was always to support Alexander, not to replace him, Henry protested. Your duty is whatever your country needs it to be, Isabella replied implacably. And, right now, your country needs you to be king. The finality in her voice made it clear that the decision was not open to negotiation or appeal. The documents were already signed, the constitutional provisions already invoked, and the wheels of transition already in motion. Within hours, the entire world would know that the Aldorian royal family had undergone a dramatic transformation that would reshape their kingdom's future. As the three younger royals filed out of the study, each lost in their own thoughts about this dramatic turn of events, Queen Isabella remained seated behind her desk, staring at the portraits of her ancestors. She had just made the most controversial decision in Aldorian royal history, potentially saving the monarchy by destroying her own family's unity. Only time would tell whether her gamble had been wise or catastrophic. The grand ballroom of Windermere Palace had been hastily converted into a press conference venue, with television cameras, lighting equipment, and dozens of journalists crowding into a space normally reserved for state dinners and royal celebrations. The irony was not lost on anyone present that they were gathering to witness the possible beginning of the end of the very institution that had built this magnificent room. Queen Isabella stood at a podium bearing the royal coat of arms, flanked by constitutional lawyers, government officials, and, notably, only one of her sons. Prince Henry stood to her right, looking profoundly uncomfortable in his formal military dress uniform, while Prince Alexander and Princess Victoria were conspicuously absent from the proceedings. The absence spoke volumes to the gathered media, who had been speculating wildly since the announcement of an emergency royal press conference had been released just 2 hours earlier. Rumors had been flying through social media and news outlets, ranging from the Queen's possible death to a scandal involving one of the princes, but none of the speculation had come close to the reality of what was about to be revealed. Prime Minister Margaret Thornfield sat in the front row, her expression carefully neutral despite the fact that she had been given only 30 minutes advance notice of the Queen's decision. The constitutional implications of what was happening would require extensive parliamentary review, but the Queen's legal authority to make such changes was ironclad, leaving the government with little choice but to accept the new reality. Ladies and gentlemen, Queen Isabella began, her voice carrying the authority of 5 decades on the throne. I address you today to announce decisions that will fundamentally alter the future of our kingdom and the royal family that has served Aldoria for more than 1,000 years. The room fell into complete silence. Every journalist present understood they were witnessing a historic moment, though none yet grasped the full magnitude of what was about to unfold. After extensive consultation with constitutional experts, government officials, and members of my family, I have concluded that the traditional succession to the throne would not serve the best interests of the Kingdom of Aldoria during these challenging times. The Queen continued, her words measured and precise. Television cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing every nuance of expression as she prepared to deliver news that would shock not just Aldoria, but royal watchers around the world. The constitutional monarchy system was built on the principle of predictable, hereditary succession, and any deviation from that norm would have ripple effects far beyond one small European kingdom. Therefore, effective immediately upon my abdication at 6 o'clock this evening, I am naming Prince Henry as my successor to the throne of Aldoria, Isabella announced, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the words that would change everything. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Journalists began shouting questions simultaneously, camera operators struggled to capture the chaos, and several government officials exchanged shocked glances. Even those who had suspected something unusual was happening had not anticipated such a complete overturning of royal protocol. Furthermore, the Queen continued, raising her voice to be heard over the commotion. Prince Alexander and Princess Victoria have been formally removed from the line of succession and stripped of their royal titles and privileges. The noise level in the room became deafening as the full implications of the announcement hit home. This wasn't merely a change in succession timing. It was a complete restructuring of the royal hierarchy that violated every expectation about how monarchies operated in the modern world. Sarah Coleman watched the broadcast from her small apartment, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. She had known that Henry was troubled by something when he had called that morning to cancel their planned lunch, but she had never imagined anything like this. The man she had come to love as a dedicated social worker and genuinely caring person was about to become one of Europe's youngest reigning monarchs. In their private suite, Alexander and Victoria watched the announcement with a mixture of rage, disbelief, and profound grief. Victoria paced behind the sofa where Alexander sat motionless, her face cycling through expressions of fury and calculation as she processed the complete destruction of their carefully planned future. "This is temporary," Victoria said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The Parliament won't stand for it. The noble families won't accept it. Someone with sense will challenge this decision through the courts." Alexander didn't respond. He was staring at the television screen, watching his younger brother stand beside their mother as she explained why he was unfit to be king. Every word felt like a personal attack. Every justification for Henry's elevation felt like a condemnation of his own failures. Back in the ballroom, Queen Isabella continued her explanation despite the chaos around her. "Prince Henry has demonstrated throughout his life the qualities that effective leadership requires in the 21st century. Genuine empathy for ordinary citizens, natural charisma, practical problem-solving abilities, and, most importantly, the trust and respect of the people he will serve." The questions from journalists came rapid-fire, each one more pointed than the last. Constitutional experts would spend weeks debating the legality of the Queen's actions, but her authority to modify succession in extraordinary circumstances was firmly established in Aldorian law, even if it had never been used so dramatically before. "Your Majesty," called out Rebecca Morrison, the BBC's royal correspondent, "can you explain how Prince Alexander responded to this decision? Why is he not present at this announcement?" Isabella's expression tightened slightly. "Prince Alexander was informed of my decision this morning. While he naturally has personal feelings about the situation, he understands that the welfare of the kingdom must take precedence over individual preferences." It was a diplomatic way of saying that Alexander had been devastated and Victoria had been furious, but royal protocol demanded that family disputes remain private even during such unprecedented public revelations. Henry stepped forward to the microphone, his nervousness obvious despite his attempts to maintain royal composure. "I want to address the people of Aldoria directly," he began, his voice steadier than anyone had expected. "I never sought this responsibility, and I understand that many of you will question whether I am prepared for it." The honesty in his admission was refreshing after years of carefully scripted royal statements that revealed nothing about the actual thoughts or feelings of their speakers. Television commentators immediately began noting the contrast between Henry's authentic uncertainty and the polished but often empty pronouncements that had characterized Alexander's public appearances. "But I can promise you this," Henry continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "I will dedicate every day of my reign to earning your trust and serving your interests. I will listen to your concerns, understand your struggles, and work tirelessly to build a kingdom that provides opportunity and dignity for every citizen." The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that had been missing from royal rhetoric for years. Social media immediately began buzzing with reactions ranging from excitement about a more accessible monarchy to outrage about the violation of traditional succession principles. Meanwhile, in Parliament, emergency sessions were being called to address the constitutional implications of the Queen's decision. While her legal authority was clear, the political ramifications were enormous. Several members of Parliament who had been critical of Alexander's leadership were quietly pleased by the change, while others worried about the precedent being set for future royal decisions. The international reaction was swift and dramatic. European royal houses issued carefully worded statements expressing support for whatever decision best served the Aldorian people, while constitutional monarchies around the world watched nervously to see if this dramatic break with tradition might inspire similar challenges to hereditary succession elsewhere. As the press conference concluded, Queen Isabella and Henry retreated to private chambers to begin the intensive preparation required for an abdication and coronation within days rather than the months or years that such transitions typically required. Constitutional lawyers, palace officials, and government representatives would work around the clock to ensure that every legal requirement was met despite the compressed timeline. Alexander remained in his suite, staring out the window at the palace gardens where he had played as a child, dreaming of the day he would be king. Those dreams now lay in ruins, replaced by an uncertain future as an ordinary citizen with no defined role or purpose. The identity that had shaped his entire life had been stripped away in a matter of hours. Victoria had moved into full strategic mode, making phone calls to influential nobles, constitutional lawyers, and political allies who might be willing to challenge the Queen's decision. Her aristocratic background had provided her with extensive connections among the traditional power structures that had historically supported the monarchy, and she was determined to use every resource at her disposal to restore her husband's rightful place. But, as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Queen's decision enjoyed broader support than anyone had anticipated. Polling numbers released that evening showed that while the process was controversial, Prince Henry's approval ratings as the new heir were significantly higher than Alexander's had been in months. The Kingdom of Aldoria was divided, but perhaps not in the way that anyone had expected. Rather than rallying behind the traditional heir, many citizens seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of a more accessible, empathetic monarch who understood their daily lives. The very qualities that had made Alexander seem like a proper royal heir to older generations made him seem out of touch and irrelevant to younger citizens who were struggling with economic uncertainty and social change. As night fell over Windermere Palace, 3 generations of royalty prepared for a future that none of them could have imagined just 24 hours earlier. The crown that had seemed destined for one brother would soon rest on another's head, while the woman who had worn it for 5 decades prepared to step down from power in the most controversial circumstances in modern royal history. The die had been cast, the announcements made, and the wheels of change set in motion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the kingdom struggled to adapt to a completely transformed royal hierarchy. But tonight, everyone involved could only wait and wonder whether Queen Isabella's dramatic gamble would save or destroy the institution she had spent her life protecting. 3 days after the shocking announcement, Windermere Palace had become a fortress under siege, not from external enemies but from the storm of controversy swirling around Queen Isabella's unprecedented decision. The ancient stone walls that had protected Aldorian royalty for centuries now shielded a family torn apart by ambition, duty, and fundamentally different visions of what the monarchy should represent in the modern world. Victoria had transformed Alexander's former study into a war room, complete with laptops, legal documents, phones, and a growing collection of supporters who refused to accept Henry's elevation to the throne. Her aristocratic connections had proven invaluable in organizing what was quickly becoming known as the Restoration Movement, though its actual legal prospects remained questionable at best. The Duchess of Millfield has confirmed her support, Victoria announced to the assembled group of nobles, constitutional lawyers, and political allies who had gathered to challenge the Queen's decision. That brings our total to 12 of the 18 major noble houses, plus significant backing from 3 former prime ministers. Lord Pemberton, whose family had served the crown for 6 generations, shook his head gravely. The constitutional precedent is clear, Your Highness. The Queen's authority to modify succession in extraordinary circumstances has never been successfully challenged in court. Then, we create new precedent, Victoria replied sharply. This isn't about constitutional law. It's about the fundamental principle that royal succession cannot be based on popular opinion polls and political expedience. Alexander sat quietly in the corner of the room, listening to the passionate arguments being made on his behalf, while struggling with increasingly complex emotions about the entire situation. Part of him was grateful for Victoria's fierce loyalty and the support of their noble allies, but another part wondered if fighting for a crown he had never truly wanted was worth tearing the kingdom apart. The past 3 days had given him time to reflect on his life and the path that had led to this moment. He had spent 35 years preparing to be king, But had he ever genuinely enjoyed the prospect? Or had he simply accepted it as an inevitable duty, the way one accepts breathing or aging? The question haunted him more than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, Henry was discovering that accepting a crown was far more complex than he had ever imagined. The crash course in constitutional law, diplomatic protocol, and royal procedure that palace officials were attempting to provide in just a few days was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Every aspect of his life, from his daily schedule to his romantic relationships, was now subject to scrutiny and official approval. Sarah Coleman had found herself thrust into the spotlight in ways she had never anticipated when she began dating a spare heir who seemed unlikely to ever inherit the throne. Royal protection officers now accompanied her everywhere. Media outlets were investigating every aspect of her background, and palace officials were delicately suggesting that her working-class origins might present challenges for her future role as queen. "I don't know if I can do this," she confided to Henry during one of their few private moments in his apartment, which was being rapidly converted to accommodate the security requirements of a king-elect. "I became a social worker because I wanted to help people, not because I wanted to be a public figure." Henry pulled her close, understanding her fears because they mirrored his own. "We'll figure it out together." The whole point of this change is supposed to be making the monarchy more accessible to ordinary people. That has to include having a queen who actually understands what ordinary people go through. But even as he spoke reassuring words, Henry wondered if they were both being naive about the realities of royal life. The institution of monarchy had survived for centuries precisely because it maintained a careful distance from the common people it served. Could that distance be bridged without destroying the mystique and respect that gave the crown its authority? Queen Isabella spent her final days as monarch reviewing every detail of the transition with constitutional experts and government officials, determined to ensure that her controversial decision could not be overturned on technical grounds. The legal framework supporting Henry's succession was airtight, but she knew that legal authority meant nothing if the kingdom descended into chaos over the change. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Queen's longtime private secretary, said carefully, "perhaps we should reconsider the timeline. A longer transition period would allow for more public education about the reasons for this change." Isabella looked up from the documents she was reviewing, her expression showing the strain of the past few days. "Edmund, we both know that delay would only provide more time for opposition to organize. The decision has been made, the constitutional requirements have been met, and the people deserve decisive leadership rather than prolonged uncertainty." The truth was that Isabella's medical condition was progressing faster than anyone outside her immediate medical team realized. The neurological symptoms that had initially prompted her to consider abdication were becoming more pronounced, making each day of continued rule increasingly risky for the kingdom's stability. In Parliament, emergency sessions continued as elected officials struggled to respond to the unprecedented situation. Prime Minister Thornfield found herself in the awkward position of supporting a royal decision that many in her own party questioned, while the opposition saw an opportunity to gain political advantage by positioning themselves as defenders of traditional constitutional principles. The Queen's decision, while legally valid, represents a dangerous departure from the predictable succession that has provided stability for our constitutional monarchy, declared opposition leader James Richardson during a heated parliamentary debate. If royal succession can be altered based on public opinion polls, what prevents future monarchs from making equally dramatic changes whenever they face criticism? The argument resonated with many citizens who, regardless of their feelings about Alexander versus Henry, were uncomfortable with the precedent being set. Constitutional monarchy depended on certain principles being considered sacred and unchangeable, and the Queen's decision had challenged one of the most fundamental of those principles. International reaction continued to be mixed but generally supportive, largely because Henry's reputation as a compassionate and effective leader had reached well beyond Aldoria's borders. His work with international humanitarian organizations had earned him respect from world leaders who saw potential for more effective diplomatic relationships with a king who understood global social issues. However, traditional monarchist organizations across Europe were deeply concerned about the implications of the Aldorian precedent. If royal succession could be modified based on contemporary political needs, it called into question the entire hereditary principle that distinguished monarchies from republics. As Henry's coronation approached, the divide within Aldorian society became increasingly apparent. Younger citizens, and those from working-class backgrounds, were generally supportive of the change, seeing Henry as someone who understood their struggles and would advocate for their interests. Older citizens and those from more traditional backgrounds were more likely to support Alexander's claim, viewing the change as an attack on the stability and dignity of royal institutions. The media coverage was relentless and often sensationalized, with every aspect of both brothers' lives being examined and re-examined for clues about their fitness for kingship. Alexander's past statements about social issues were scrutinized for evidence of elitism, while Henry's romantic relationship with Sarah was analyzed for its potential impact on royal dignity. Victoria's restoration movement gained momentum when several prominent business leaders expressed concerns about the economic implications of the royal transition. International investors, they argued, valued stability above all else, and dramatic changes to fundamental institutions could damage Aldoria's reputation as a reliable partner for long-term investments. We're not just talking about changing kings, Victoria declared during a televised interview that palace officials had tried unsuccessfully to prevent. We're talking about abandoning the principles that have made Aldoria a stable, prosperous nation for centuries. The monarchy isn't a popularity contest. It's an institution that provides continuity and dignity regardless of temporary political trends. The interview was compelling television, showcasing Victoria's intelligence and passionate conviction while highlighting legitimate concerns about the precedent being set. Social media response was deeply divided, with hashtags supporting both Alexander and Henry trending simultaneously as the kingdom's citizens chose sides in a debate that went to the heart of what monarchy should represent in the 21st century. Henry watched the interview from his temporary office in the palace, feeling the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders with each passing hour. He had never wanted to be king, had never imagined himself in this position, and was beginning to understand that good intentions and genuine empathy might not be sufficient for the challenges ahead. She makes some valid points, he admitted to his chief advisor, Sir Michael Crenshaw, who had been hastily appointed to help manage the transition. Maybe I'm not ready for this. Maybe the kingdom would be better served by someone with more traditional preparation. Sir Michael, a veteran diplomat who had served 3 monarchs, studied the young prince carefully. Your Majesty-elect, every king in history has felt unprepared for the crown. The difference is that you're honest about those feelings rather than hiding behind false confidence. But honesty, Henry was learning, could be a liability in royal life. The institution of monarchy had traditionally derived much of its authority from the appearance of certainty and divine appointment. A king who openly questioned his own qualifications might be seen as refreshingly authentic or dangerously weak, depending on the observer's perspective. As the sun set on the 4th day since the announcement, the kingdom of Aldoria found itself more divided than it had been in generations. The coronation was still scheduled for the following week, but it was becoming increasingly clear that it would mark the beginning of a new chapter in royal history rather than a simple transition from one traditional monarch to another. The resistance to Henry's succession was real and growing, but so was the support for a more accessible and empathetic approach to royal leadership. The outcome would depend not just on constitutional law and political maneuvering, but on the fundamental question of what role monarchy should play in a modern democratic society. Queen Isabella prepared for her final days on the throne, knowing that her decision had fractured her family and divided her kingdom, but still believing that she had chosen the path most likely to preserve the institution she had devoted her life to protecting. History would judge whether her gamble had been wise or catastrophic, but for now, she could only move forward with the conviction that difficult times required difficult choices. The morning of Henry's coronation dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the ancient stained-glass windows of Westminster Cathedral. Outside, crowds had been gathering since before dawn, a mixture of enthusiastic supporters, curious onlookers, and vocal protesters whose chants could be heard even within the cathedral's thick walls. Inside the sacred space where Aldorian monarchs had been crowned for 8 centuries, the atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Representatives from royal houses across Europe sat alongside elected officials, military leaders, and carefully selected members of the public who had won a lottery for the honor of witnessing this historic moment. Henry stood in a private chamber behind the altar, wearing the ceremonial robes that had been hastily altered to fit his slightly smaller frame. The weight of the fabric seemed insignificant compared to the weight of responsibility that would soon be placed upon his shoulders along with the ancient crown of Aldoria. Sarah stood beside him, resplendent in a gown that had been designed and created in just 5 days by the kingdom's most talented designers. Her transformation from social worker to queen consort was nearly complete, though both she and Henry knew that the real challenges would begin after the ceremony ended, and they had to govern a deeply divided kingdom. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson from the community center," Sarah said quietly, referring to an elderly woman who had been struggling to pay for her medications. "Yesterday, she was one of the people I was trying to help. Today I'm supposed to be her queen. It doesn't feel real." Henry took her hand, drawing comfort from her presence as he had throughout this whirlwind week. "Maybe that's exactly why we're the right people for this job. If it felt natural to us, that might mean we'd lost touch with what ordinary people go through." Through the chamber's small window, they could see television crews from around the world broadcasting live coverage of an event that had captured international attention. The story of a spare heir becoming king while his older brother was stripped of royal status was unprecedented in modern royal history, and millions of viewers were tuning in to witness either a triumphant new beginning or a constitutional disaster. In another part of the cathedral, Alexander sat in the section reserved for distinguished guests rather than the royal family area where he had expected to spend his entire life. Victoria beside him maintained perfect composure, but her clenched hands betrayed the fury that still burned within her over what she considered a betrayal of everything the monarchy represented. The legal challenges to Henry's succession had ultimately failed, as constitutional experts had predicted. The Queen's authority to modify succession in extraordinary circumstances was too well established in Aldorian law to be successfully contested, despite the best efforts of Victoria's legal team and their noble allies. But failure in the courts had not ended the restoration movement. If anything, it had made Victoria more determined to pursue other avenues for challenging what she saw as an illegitimate transfer of power. She had spent the previous week building alliances with political figures who shared her concerns about the precedent being set, and she was prepared to spend years fighting for what she believed was right. Alexander's feelings were more complex. The past week had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his suitability for kingship that he had been avoiding for years. His relief at being freed from the burden of the crown was almost as strong as his grief over losing his birthright, creating an internal conflict that he was only beginning to understand. Queen Isabella sat in the front row, wearing the ceremonial dress that she would never wear again after today. At 83, she looked every year of her age, but her eyes remained sharp and determined as she prepared to witness the culmination of the most controversial decision of her reign. The medical reports hidden in her desk drawer painted an increasingly grim picture of her neurological condition, but she had been determined to remain mentally competent long enough to see Henry properly installed as king. After today, she could allow herself to step back from public life and face whatever challenges her declining health might bring. Archbishop Michael Westbrook approached the altar, carrying the ancient ceremonial items that would be used in the coronation service. The crown of Aldoria, crafted in the 14th century and modified by each subsequent monarch, seemed to glow in the colored lights streaming through the cathedral windows. The ceremony began with traditional hymns and prayers that had been used for centuries, connecting Henry's coronation to an unbroken chain of royal succession that stretched back to the kingdom's founding. But everyone present understood that this coronation was different, that it represented a fundamental break with precedent rather than a simple continuation of tradition. As Henry and Sarah walked down the cathedral's main aisle, the mixture of applause and scattered protests from the crowd outside grew louder. Opinion polls showed the kingdom almost evenly divided about the succession change, with slightly more citizens supporting Henry's elevation than opposing it. But the margin was narrow enough to ensure ongoing political tension. International observers noted the presence of several European monarchs who had chosen to attend despite the controversial circumstances, suggesting that the royal community was prepared to accept Henry's legitimacy regardless of how he had acquired the throne. Their attendance provided important symbolic support for the new king's authority. The coronation ceremony itself proceeded flawlessly, with Archbishop Westbrook performing the ancient rituals that transformed Henry from prince to king, while television cameras captured every moment for broadcast around the world. When the crown was finally placed on his head, Henry felt the weight of 1,000 years of royal history settling onto his shoulders. Sarah's coronation as queen immediately followed, making her the first working-class woman to wear the crown of Aldoria. Her genuine emotion during the ceremony was obvious and moving, creating a powerful television moment that resonated with viewers who had never before seen someone like themselves in the royal family. But Even as the ceremony reached its climax, the underlying tensions that had created this extraordinary situation remained unresolved. Victoria's supporters in the cathedral maintained respectful silence during the proceedings, but their disapproval was palpable. The division within the royal family was now formalized and public, creating ongoing challenges for Henry's reign. The new king's first official act was to deliver a coronation address that had been carefully crafted to acknowledge the controversial circumstances of his succession while outlining his vision for the kingdom's future. His words were broadcast live to the nation and around the world. "I stand before you today not because I sought this crown, but because our kingdom needs leadership that understands the challenges facing ordinary families," Henry declared, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral and to the millions watching on television. "I promise to be a king who listens more than he speaks, who serves more than he rules, and who never forgets that the crown belongs not to me but to the people of Aldoria." The address was well received by his supporters, who saw it as evidence of the authentic, accessible leadership they had hoped for. Critics, however, worried that such language diminished the dignity and authority that effective monarchy required. As the ceremony concluded and the new royal couple prepared to return to Windermere Palace, Queen Isabella experienced a profound mixture of relief and melancholy. She had successfully transferred power to the son she believed was best equipped to lead Aldoria through its current challenges, but she had also fractured her family in ways that might never heal. Alexander and Victoria left the cathedral without participating in the traditional post-coronation celebrations, their absence noted by media outlets around the world. They had attended the ceremony out of respect for the institution of monarchy, but they would not pretend to celebrate what they considered a betrayal of everything they had devoted their lives to protecting. The weeks and months that followed would test whether Henry's approach to kingship could successfully bridge the gap between traditional royal authority and contemporary democratic values. Early polling suggested cautious optimism among the citizens, but the international community remained watchful for signs of either success or failure in this unprecedented experiment. Sarah's first official engagements as queen were carefully chosen to highlight her background and commitment to social issues, visiting the same community centers and charitable organizations where she had worked before her elevation to the throne. The symbolism was powerful, but critics questioned whether such activities were appropriate for a reigning monarch. Victoria continued to build her restoration movement, convinced that time would prove the wisdom of traditional succession principles and the dangers of popularity-based royal selection. She had accepted that legal challenges were unlikely to succeed, but she remained determined to preserve alternative approaches for future consideration. Alexander began the difficult process of rebuilding his identity as a private citizen, exploring opportunities in business and charitable work that would allow him to contribute to society without the burden of royal expectations. The adjustment was painful, but it also offered freedoms he had never experienced during his life as heir apparent. As the sun set on coronation day, the kingdom of Aldoria found itself with a new king and queen whose authenticity and empathy had captured the imagination of many citizens, but whose untraditional path to the throne had created ongoing questions about the nature of royal authority in the modern world. Queen Isabella, now officially the Queen Mother, retired to her private chambers knowing that her controversial decision had given the monarchy its best chance of remaining relevant in the 21st century. Whether that chance would be successfully realized depended on Henry's ability to govern effectively while maintaining the accessible, empathetic approach that had made him popular with the people. The crown had chosen its path, but the true test of that choice would unfold over the years to come as King Henry and Queen Sarah attempted to prove that monarchy could evolve without losing its essential character. The kingdom they now ruled was divided and uncertain, but it was also filled with hope for a new kind of royal leadership that might bridge the ancient institution of monarchy with the democratic values of contemporary society. History would ultimately judge whether Queen Isabella's gamble had saved or destroyed the Aldorian monarchy, but for now, the crown rested on new heads, carried by new hearts, toward an uncertain but potentially transformative future.